Hello, hello. Good morning or afternoon. um, this is lecture number 8, and we're covering the origins of the American Revolution. So we're talking about the 1750s all the way up to 1775. All right. Your key points for the day: the French and Indian War, the Stamp Act, the Intolerable Acts, the First Continental Congress, and the philosophy of revolt. All right. So that is what we're going to be going over. Don't forget, if you haven't already done it, and you should have, you need to watch the PowerPoint about the podcast slash book review. Um, you need to start getting to work on it. Whether you do a podcast review or a book review, it will be due on the 9th of November. So you need to get going. All right. So today, though, let's talk about the origins of the American Revolution. And we get started, of course, with the first key point, the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War occurs from 1754 to 1763. This is this is considered by many historians as the First World War. All right. On the slides that you guys have in front of you, it's a bunch of questions, right? I ask who instigated this war. I asked who the war was between, what it was fought over, who won, and its significance. So that's kind of going to be what we're talking about. All right. So let's start with who it was between. This is titled the French and Indian War, but in truth, the main two competitors were the French and the British. The French and the British were competing for colonies the world over. All right. And this aspect of it, what is usually referred to here in America as the French and Indian War, is the contest over who is going to control North America. All right. This war is also known as the 7 Years' War. All right. What instigated this war was here in the U.S. George Washington was a young, up-and-coming military man, I guess you'd say. And it would be his problem. His duty to go into territory that the British would want and hand out writs of eviction, basically eviction notices, to the French. The British were trying to get them out so they could push further west. While this was going on, George was very excited to have his first commission. This is what he had looked forward to his entire life. George Washington had always wanted to be an army man. He wanted to be in the thick of battle. So he was more than happy to go out with his group of men and hand out these writs of eviction. However, this would go poorly. All right, very poorly. Washington would end up fighting with the French, and in the end, getting captured. But what instigated all this is that Washington had Native American guides, and they were helping him get through the countryside to get to these places to hand out these eviction notices. One night, the guides came to him and let him know that there was the French out in front of them, and the French had their native guides. And Washington's native guides told him that they were in ambush. They were ready for Washington to come through, and they were going to attack him when he came through the next day. So Washington decided the best way to stop this from happening is to attack first, right? So what he ended up doing was he and his men got ready, and in the middle of the night attacked this French group. They would basically kill them all and wipe them out. And as it would turn out, this was not a bunch of French soldiers. This was not a party that was attacking, that was going to surprise attack Washington the next day. It was relatives of the royalty of France on vacation in America, seeing the countryside. So, what we find out later is the native guides that Washington had hired were from a tribe that hated the tribe of native guides that were escorting the French. So this was Washington's natives were wanting to kill them. So they lied to Washington to get him to attack. All right, so Washington and his men mistakenly kill relatives of the French royalty because of his guides. However, this was Washington's real first taste of battle, and he loved it. He had bullet holes that went through his coat, and he was thrilled. In his journals, he writes that he had never felt more alive than at that moment. So in many ways, you can see that Washington was an adrenaline junkie, right? But this is huge. This is an assassination. This is an act of war. In the end, the French would track Washington down. They would capture him. And Washington, when he found out what happened, was appalled. This was horrific to him. But he felt it upon him, he felt it landed on him to fix this. So he tried to negotiate with the French. However, Washington didn't speak French, but he had hired a man that spoke French. So between his hire and the French, they worked out what Washington thought was a peace treaty. The French ended up bringing it in. Washington would end up signing it, but it wasn't a peace treaty. It wasn't what Washington thought it was. It was actually it was an admission of guilt. Washington admitted by signing it that he had assassinated French royalty, and this was a declaration of war on the French. And as it turned out, the guy he hired to be his French translator really couldn't speak French. Couldn't read it for sure. So, two things you can see right here with Washington, with him hiring people to do things for him. He wasn't that good at it. Two different, the French translator and his native guides both messed him up, betrayed him. And this would be this was the instigation of the French and Indian War. One of the major parts of it anyway. So, you have here in the U.S., the French and the British competing for control of the North American continent. In the end, the British would win and push the French out of most of North America. With this, the real importance of it is this kind of sets it sets up the end of the British colonies and the beginning of the American colonies. Because at the end of this, the British start taxing. The British start enforcing a lot more rules. The British expect more from the colonies than ever before, and the colonials don't like it. All right. So the true importance is, even though the British win this, in the end, this is one of the major factors that leads to the American Revolution. All right. So you've got your first key point. We've got the French and Indian War. Let's kind of go over briefly some of the acts of the Revolution. All right. In the beginning, All right, you had things like the Navigation Act, the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and the Mutiny Act. These were all just different ways that the British would be trying to and really accomplishing getting more money or trying to garner more control over daily life in the colonies. All right. Not really going to talk a lot about them because we've got the big ones. All right. Others. All right. These are the ones that really got the colonies riled up. Those in the beginning got everything started, but the very first one that really kind of kickstarts everything is the Stamp Act. All right, this was put out in 1765. And the Stamp Act was a tax on all printed goods, whether it was newspapers, documents, pamphlets, cards, playing cards, dice, anything that was printed. Um, the British would levy a tax on, and a large tax. But what really upset the colonists is they did their own printing, right? They printed everything. So the British were taxing them on something they did for themselves. And this really, really upset the colonials. So, Stamp Act. This is a tax on printed goods. All right. This would cause all kinds of hullabaloo. Hopefully, you've watched the Benjamin Franklin Citizen of the World PBS biography. And in that, you'll notice that this is one of the places where Benjamin Franklin becomes very important. Franklin would be sent to England to argue to get rid of this. All right. The Stamp Act would be the first one that would really, really rile the colonials, especially people in Massachusetts. Also, another big one, another big series of acts that would upset the colonials are the Townshend Acts. All right. They're also known as the Townshend Program. You have three parts. All right. You have a Mutiny Act, you have the Townshend Duties, and you have the Custom Crackdowns. All right. Those are the main sections of everything. The Mutiny Act, which would later become known as the Quartering Act. The Mutiny Act is where the Brits would be sending soldiers over. They'd be sending soldiers over to the colonies, and the colonials were meant to take care of them. So the British were sending soldiers over to patrol them, control them, and the colonials would have to board them, feed them, take care of them. This did not go over well. Also, with the township duties, these would be levying taxes on things that the colonials didn't have, right? Like paint, lead, different things that the colonials depended upon the British for. The British would send them over, and so the colonials could use them and buy them, things like that. So, since the Stamp Act went over so poorly, Townshend thought that, well, since they didn't want to be taxed on things they did for themselves, why not? They shouldn't be too upset if they were taxed on things they didn't have for themselves that were given to them by the crown. Between the Mutiny Act, the Townshend Duties, and the last one, Custom Crackdowns, they created more customs houses throughout the colonies, and these custom houses were meant to stop smuggling. To the British Crown, smuggling was any trading that was going on with any other country or any other groups outside of England itself. So to the English, anybody that the colonials traded with that wasn't the home country was smuggling. So they created more customs houses and really started cracking down on this. So, with these three going, what they would do is the colonials would boycott. They'd boycott all the British goods and leave them sitting in the boats in the harbors. And they would refuse the Mutiny Act. and try to get more creative with their trade outside of the British Empire. So, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Program, incites the colonials against the British. The British are trying to mess with the colonials' money. The next big one, of course, is the Tea Act. This was in 1773. Um, this is different than most people think. All right, the Tea Act didn't force the colonials to buy expensive tea. What it was doing is, with the Tea Act, the British had huge amounts of tea from all over the world, sitting in warehouses everywhere, going nowhere. They weren't making any money on it. Nothing was happening. So the British decided to bring all of their tea, as much as they could, to the colonies and make the colonies buy the tea from them and sell from them. And the British were selling this tea extremely cheaply, just trying to get rid of it. But what this would do, and you got to remember, this is the British American colonies. Tea was a very important thing and was a very big part of daily life. If the British brought this tea in, it would disrupt the tea trade in America and put all of these tea merchants out of business. It would throw off the American economy in some ways. So this angered Americans as well, that the British would come in and try to take away their business and force them to buy this British tea. Also, the last big one, these are known as the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts. Like the Stamp Act was a key point, the Intolerable Acts are a key point. Like I said, in the books that you see, it'll be the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts. These are the last acts of the British Parliament and the King that would incite the colonials to war. All right, the first one is the Boston Port Bill. The Boston Port Bill shut down Boston Harbor. Nothing went in, nothing went out. The British saw Massachusetts, and more specifically Boston, as the hub of dissent. This is, of course, where the Sons of Liberty were from. This is where most of the violence had occurred. This seemed to be the starting point of what could, hopefully not, in the British eyes, turn into a revolution. So, we have this port bill. All right. With the Boston Port Bill, Boston started reaching out to the other colonies, the other, colonial governments, looking for help. They wanted unity. The Bostonians wanted people to come, back them up, and start pushing back against the crown. The next big step was the Massachusetts Government Act. The royal governor of Massachusetts was given ultimate authority. The royal governor, of course, is appointed by the king, and with this, the royal governor ran government throughout Massachusetts. So town meetings in all the ways that the colonials had always ran and handled day-to-day business, day-to-day government, how they had always controlled their own government here in the colonies was over. The Massachusetts Government Act ended self-government. This is the thing that worried the other 12 colonies. They thought that if the British Crown could so easily strip away their rights, that they needed to start really maybe organizing and working together, because this could be a major, major problem. You also have the Administration of Justice Act. With the Administration of Justice Act, the big thing to remember and think about is that with the Sons of Liberty, with these groups that were popping up in the colonies that were fighting back against these British stamp collectors, and that was a big one. With the Stamp Act, these stamp collectors were harangued, harassed, killed, beaten, all kinds of things. You know, the Sons of Liberty burned down stamp collectors' houses, their businesses, and not only did they do that, but sometimes with the stamp collectors and sometimes with these protests, with these other things that we've talked about, they would, strip these agents of the British Crown down to where they're not wearing any clothing. They would put tar all over them and feather them. They would also ride them out of town on the rail. They'd do all kinds of things that were meant to create severe, severe injuries and, in many cases, death. With like tar and feathering, once you have that on the skin, if it covers the skin enough and they do a thorough enough job, it could suffocate the people. They can't get the tar off. And if you peel the tar off, it takes off all the layers of the skin because it seeps into the skin. A lot of, people could die from tar and feathering. Also, just, ripping their clothes off and beating them until unconsciousness didn't go over well either. And then riding out of the town on the rail was another one. They would take up a section of picket fence, put the British on the picket fence, tie their arms and legs to it, and carry them out, having them bounce on that fence. It's vicious, vicious form of protest. This is not peaceful protest at all. So, with this Administration of Justice Act, the British were trying to crack down on this, trying to crack down on this violent protest from the Sons of Liberty and others. And what they would do is, one of the things they'd figured out is that when these men would be arrested for this violence here in America, if they'd go before American courts, more often than not, they would get off scot-free. The American courts wouldn't go after them. So with this Administration of Justice Act, it was saying that if anybody was arrested for committing acts of violence against agents of the Crown, they would be sent to England. Sent all the way to England to be tried. All right. Also, this is another big one, the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act is the Mutiny Act. All right. The Mutiny Act becomes the Quartering Act with the Intolerable Acts. The Mutiny Act portion of this, which is now called the Quartering Act, is the same thing. They're wanting them to pay for and take care of the troops. So the British are sending troops over here to enforce British law and control the colonials, but the colonials are forced to pay for room and board. This does not go over well at all, like it did in the township program. So with these Intolerable Acts, this is a last straw to many in the colonies. So what happens is they call the First Continental Congress together. And this is your next key point. This First Continental Congress meets from September the 5th to mid-October. All right. In this First Continental Congress, they are discussing what should they do about all these taxes, what should they do about revolt, what should they do about this situation with the Crown. In the end, they decide to send a petition to the Crown in Parliament. This petition that Congress creates is the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. Right? The Declaration of Rights and Grievances is a legal document that is meant to be an olive branch. Right? They're sending it to the Crown saying, look, these are the things that you are doing. Those are the grievances that we don't like. These are our rights as British citizens. And basically what it says, if we could just go back to the way things were before all of these taxes, before things got crazy, things will be fine. Let's just put all of this craziness that has been happening aside. and go back to the way things used to be. So that is the intent of this First Continental Congress. And as you guys and gals can tell by where you live or where you're going to school, that didn't happen. All right. Before we wrap that up, talking about that, let's talk about I think it's our last key point, the philosophy of revolt. Let's see. Yeah, it is. It's our last key point of the day. Let's talk about the philosophy of revolt. The major sources for this revolt is ideology, philosophy. Several different things really do this. One of the major ones, of course, is local experiences. By this point, the colonies had been here more than 100 years and had been running themselves during that whole time. So, local political experiences. They had controlled and had done local government and had been running their own governments here for more than 100 years. They were used to doing things their way. Also, they had their own local religion. With the First Great Awakening sweeping through, you have the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists coming in. You also have the old Puritan ways, the separatist ways with the Congregationalists. The Americas had their own ways of doing things. So not only do you have these local experiences, you also have the people that would become our founding fathers, like Franklin and Jefferson, Madison, Washington, and all of these other men, more than 70 of them in total, that would really kind of create and make the United States of America. One of the big things with these men were they were very much students of the Enlightenment and scientific revolution. All right. And we talked about this before in British colonial America, the Enlightenment, with humanism, with rationalism. And this was a very important part of the American mind, this Enlightenment mindset. People like John Locke, Montesquieu, Montaigne, David Hume, all of these political philosophers of the Enlightenment would play a huge role in shaping our founding fathers. Our founding fathers were highly educated and read all of these things and used these ideas to create our system. So our political system is based on this Enlightenment philosophy, which is, of course, based on humanism and rationalism. Rationalism, of course, is the process of logically going through a situation, logically, scientifically, trying to create a solution to a problem, right? Humanism is believing, the way I explained it to you guys in colonial America tends to kind of do a good job of hitting home quickest. Remember, John Locke wrote this treatise on tabula rasa. Right? Tabula rasa means blank slate. He believed that human beings were born blank slates. We are not born good. We are not born evil. We are just born. And according to this Enlightenment idea, this humanistic approach, if we give this newborn a good education, a good environment, good parenting, good things, they would be good people. If they were born into a bad situation, had bad parents, had bad educations, they would be bad people. So this idea of humanism is kind of like nurture and nature. It's this idea of that. But it's also this idea that we need to move away from superstition. We need to move away from religion, and that to make a better world, we need to use reason. We need to think our way through it And we need to create new things for a better society. We don't need stronger religion. We need to create a better society. We need better rules for this society. So this is a push toward secularism. All right. So it's important to remember that America, as the founding fathers created it, the basis of it was the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, not religion. Christianity and religion wouldn't become important in American history until later, on into the 1800s. We'll get to that. But for the founders, the basis of this new country is humanism, rationalism, major tenets of the Enlightenment, and also the local experiences that we had that we could learn from, right? Not spiritual, it's it's tangible, it's real things. And of course, the other major thing that gives us this philosophy of the revolt is something that you've heard since you were little, if you grew up in the American system: no taxation without representation. All right? This is fairly straightforward. All right? What it means by no taxation without representation is simple. The colonials believed that for them to be taxed, they should have places in Parliament. You know, each one of the colonies should have representatives in England in Parliament so they could vote, just like other members of Parliament. Does that make sense to everybody? Hopefully it does. So in other words, what no taxation without representation means is the colonials believed they should have tangible, real people in Parliament that would have a voice in Parliament. This didn't make sense to the British. To the British, Parliament represented everybody in the British Empire. It was a looser view of representation. So for the colonials, this was a really important thing. They needed bodies in seats participating for it to be representation. All right. So we have the key components, the key pieces of this philosophy of revolt. Another thing to get into, talk about briefly, are some of the origin sites, some of the origin places of the revolution. One of the most important places were pubs and taverns. After people worked, of course, the men went to drink with other friends. So the pubs and taverns became very big in circulating pamphlets, circulars, and giving speeches, everything else. This is where men met after they were done with their day, and they talked about what they didn't like, what they wanted, what they, passed around ideas. So, the origins of the revolution are in the bars. Also, in churches and schools. As larger and larger groups came to dissent and wanted to organize, pubs and taverns weren't big enough. So this would move to larger places like schools and churches where they would start to meet and organize. As it got bigger, you'd move on to town greens, town squares, things like that. So you have this organization, you have these origin sites where colonials came together, right, and would talk and work through and organize how they're going to fight this issue. All right. Another thing we probably should cover, some of the major events. All right. I'm sure you've heard of the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. These were events that, of course, take place in Massachusetts that would help instigate and infuriate the colonials and really start turning them in larger and larger numbers against the British. All right. With the Boston Massacre, this is the first one. This happens in March of 1770. And this is, of course, where British troops that patrolled the streets ended up shooting what the newspapers that went out in America would say innocent Americans. It's a lot more complicated than that. these innocent Americans were, in many ways, accosting them. And we're not really sure who fired that first shot. It could have been the colonials trying to instigate this. But either way you look at it, the Boston Massacre goes out in the newspapers across the nation and promotes the idea that these British troops killed unarmed, innocent Americans. Right? This is infuriating for many. You also have, of course, the Boston Tea Party. This is where the Americans turned Boston Harbor into the largest cup of tea in the world. And this was a major event because this event would lead to the coercive acts. Evidently, you can do all kinds of things to the British, but once you mess with their tea, things get extremely serious. So, with the Boston Tea Party, with these Americans tossing the tea into the harbor, this would lead to the final grouping of acts that would lead to the Continental Congress and finally to war. When King George and Lord North, King George, of course, King George III, and Lord North, of the Prime Minister, when they would get this Declaration of Rights and Grievances, they would just ignore it. They would say that the colonials either had to obey or fight. So this is the beginning of this war. Also, a little side note, and we'll end on this side note. King George III, of course, the royalty in Europe is extremely inbred. And tends to have all kinds of genetic issues. One of the things that has been passed through the British lineage with George's family, back at this point, was what became known as the royal malady. Nobody's really quite sure about everything about this, but we do know that in times of great stress, in times where things were really tense, it tended to get worse. It was some kind of enzyme problem, and you could tell at the onset when he was about to have these fits of lunacy, these fits where he would go crazy. He would pee fluorescent pink, and it would burn like fire. And he would be stark raving mad. And through most of his reign as King of England, they like to point out that he tended to be a very good king. But during this time in the 1770s and 80s, when you had the starting of the revolt and the revolt itself, the Americans drove King George mad during this time frame. So, if you want to, it's really kind of all kinds of crazy, interesting stories you can get into if you want to dig. But with that, it's the origins of the revolution. We talked a little bit about events, acts, and places. Documents. Kind of getting into and covering the important origins of this revolution. All right. This is the lecture for the origins of the revolution. Everybody have a good weekend.